So that's the presentation part of our panel. Now, normally at a panel like this, at a history conference, especially a larger one like the Society for Military History, would have a chair and a commenter. The chair's job is to keep the panel moving. The commenter's job is to look at what everyone's written, presented on, give some suggestions for how to take the papers moving forward, and make kind of these grave pronouncements about how these presentations represent the future of the field. I do just want to say really quickly for younger scholars who might be watching, conference papers never represent the future of the field. Conferences are about meeting people. Panels are organized ways to meet people in a certain field and for them to get feedback on their ideas. If something's really groundbreaking, look for it in a journal in a year or so. In the meantime, talk to people at conferences. It's how the real work gets done, and that's what we're going to do right now. So we have some questions lined up from our audience, and we are going to get right to them. Our first one is for Chris. All right. Regarding AI policy and development. Here, I'll wait for things to settle. Okay. Regarding AI policy and development, it seems that everything comes down to incentives for both the AI and for those developing them. How do we establish incentives for those tech developers to avoid the AI disjunction you've outlined?
Well, AI application is just now entering the public awareness enough to generate centers of gravity for varying opinions. Like the two main narratives I've seen shaping are safety, like in self-driving cars, and bias, as in credit risk assessment. Really, it's not up to developers, tech developers, to define those ethical boundaries. The way we kind of handle this in the United States in terms of any technology is the market makes demands, vendors provide them, and the results shape the market, and that feedback loop continues. We've started to see a couple of those loops finished as like people start to report that like, if you make an AI that optimizes bus routes, they tend to drive around places that are predominantly peopled by African Americans because it assigns like a higher risk to that area. And that's just the statistics. And so, the society has to decide, are we okay with that or not? And those discussions are ongoing. I think it's a little preemptive to take legislative action because, first of all, you have to define what AI even means. And it's a notoriously hard thing to do. It's even a struggle to define what a computer is. Like if you try to define what a computer is, try it as an exercise for yourself. It's hard to come up with a definition that doesn't logically include humans in it. So I think both the technology is a little too nascent to come up with a hard enough definition to legislate against it, and the public opinions haven't quite settled enough to decide how hard to go with that legislation. So the reality is we're still kind of in the wait and see phase, unfortunately.
All right, fantastic. Now, this one's kind of for the panel as a whole. Cold War science fiction often predicted a dystopian future of population loss or war, or in which AI becomes a threat. How do you all view the predictive quality or the influence of past science fiction about our current time versus our current ability to project forward? What lessons can we learn from past science fiction creators if we want to use fiction as a tool to explore future trends in warfare? So basically, give us your understanding of ficking, guys. What do you think it's good for? What do you think the purpose of something like NavyCon is? Let's get existential.
I'll jump on that one first, since that's sort of what the overall arching theme of my talk was about, which is I think the big utility for FICINT isn't in the predictive nature so much. It goes back to the old saying, often attributed to Marshall and Eisenhower, that plans are useless, but planning is invaluable. In the same way, using FICINT for predictions is probably useless, but using them to expand our horizons, sort of identify possible scenarios and think through what the implications of those scenarios could be is invaluable. And I think this gets back to what Chris was talking about in his talk, where he's talking about how if we think out and sort of identify where we can have things like these AI disjunctions and where those might come from and can try and get ahead of the problem, then we'll be a lot better off in the long run and not wind up in a situation like in 40K where we have Iron Men popping out of an STC trying to kill Gaunt and his ghosts or something. So that is where I see that real value there, is just helping to introduce thoughts and concepts that we might not have thought of otherwise, just looking at strictly the historical record, although you can't completely ignore history as well. It's just another part of the puzzle.
So, Andy, there actually is a practical implication for that, which is you should write more fic-int, right? So the problem is not that, all the stuff from the Cold War era was wrong. It's just that, maybe a small subset of it was right, and that subset wasn't the one that was available. So the more you have available now, the more you generate now, the wider you source it when you originally create it, the more likely it is you'll include some really right or good things somewhere in there. You just have to be able to sift those out, although that's a different problem than generating it in the first place. So,
yeah, I mean, of course, most of your Cold War fic-int's going to be dominated by the concept of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War going hot. Everything from Red Storm Rising to some of the far future dystopians that came out of that. And then also, I'd also point out it wasn't just that era looking at the Cold War. Current sociological trends. I mean, look at movies like Escape from New York. I mean, there's a whole subgenre of movies out there about urban dystopias where crime had just completely taken over.
Yeah, and on that note, I want to get Jay in on this real quick because, Jay, you presented on this kind of anarcho-capitalist system, which really kind of fell out of favor post 9/11. But I'm interested in your thoughts on, how this can be useful for policymakers today if we look at the cyberpunk literature in general. What trends can we see? What triggers are common to a lot of these properties? Go ahead.
Well, to be real vague there, it's going back to the dead Prussia, and it's like war is a human endeavor. So we're all dealing with humans. Whether it be cyberpunk or any of the things anybody's talked about here, you can talk about innovation, technology, whatever you want. It's how humans deal with these things, how things are incentivized for humans to do what they perceive to be their own self-interest. So I think that's something to always remember about, whatever we're all talking about here. If we've got humans involved, they're going to attempt to do what they perceive to be in their best interest, and that could be bad for others, could be positive. It's just playing that out, and I think that's kind of what all the panels here dealt with in some way.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right, and we can see that in books like Cold Cash and in Neuromancer, kind of playing out through this very monetary seeking, or economic gain seeking rather dynamic rather than necessarily political power or values. Would you say that's fair?
Right, exactly. Case and and Gibson's books, that sort of thing. They're all kind of doing what's, if not necessarily monetary, at least what's fun for them though, but they're not really tied into a cause greater than self necessarily. So.
All right. And I think, Nick, you've got something to say on this, so go ahead and that'll wrap us up.
Yeah, so I just want to pile on what Jay said. I have a lot of personal issues with Clausewitz, but on that point, I actually do agree with him that that war is an inherently human thing. And so I've actually been writing the classics column for the Metastellar magazine, and that involves going back to the public domain, like 1950s and 60s short stories, to see, what have we missed, what was awesome, and what is still relevant today. And there are so many good stories out there from so many different authors that still resonate with all the things we're talking about today, whether it's the human side of war or whether they're prescient and, talking about Mari Wolf wrote a story called Robots of the World Arise. Definitely go read that, because the last line is the most, it'll put you on your seat. But I think what's most important now with fiction and fic-int and how we're using it in the national defense or even geopolitical community is giving it legitimacy and understanding that just because it's not a fact-based research paper doesn't mean it doesn't have value and we can't learn from it.
All right. Thanks so much, guys. That's our time. Folks in the Discord right now, if we did not get to your question, that is coming in a chat message. Thank you so much for attending NavyCon. We appreciate it. Check out our next panel, To Boldly Go, featuring the authors of that book. And we will see you there. It's in 5 minutes.